Hi Sylvia, Silvana from Chile. Great. We've already got some people using the chat box, which is excellent. I encourage you all to do so. If you have questions or anything else that you'd like to share with us, please pop that in the chat box. We'll be answering questions throughout and a little bit at the end as well. And I guess just to kick off, I should probably introduce myself. My name is Britta Wyatt. I am here from Oxentia. If you've not heard of Oxentia, we are an innovation, consulting, and commercialization services company. We're based in the UK, in Oxford, and we actually started life as a unit at the University of Oxford, where I will have worked with Chris and his colleagues before. So Chris and I know each other from back in the day when we were co-workers there. So Oxentia, we've been hosting webinars monthly over the last few months to try and create a way to keep engagement with the innovation community. And we're very delighted to have Chris Fellingham from the University of Oxford's Tech Transfer Office here today with us. We're going to be doing this in a Q&A sort of fireside chat, as much as you can do a fireside chat on the internet. And really looking forward to talking a bit with Chris about his experiences of innovation in the social sciences. I think we've got about maybe 30 minutes scheduled today, plus some Q&A time at the end and throughout, and we'll just sort of see where the conversation takes us over the next half an hour. I will say that for those of you who do enjoy the topic today or the session today, we are doing these monthly, and there will be another webinar coming up on the 2nd of December. That one is called Making Sure You Are Investment Ready, and my colleague Holly Ann Baldwin will be speaking to Francesca O'Brien from the Syndicate Room, and it should be an interesting chat as well. So I suppose with that introduction, we might as well kick off. And I wondered, Chris, if you would just take a little minute to introduce yourself to the group today.
Hi, everyone. Firstly, Oxentia, thank you very much for inviting me today. So I work at Oxford University Innovation, which is the technology transfer arm of the university, and I work in social sciences, humanities and social ventures, which, as I think we'll get onto a bit later, are all quite tightly coupled. And I've been doing that role for about 2.5 years. I also have a second hat, which is I lead the research commercialization group at Aspect, which is a network for promoting innovation and commercialization in the social sciences. And I am now the head of what I'm going to tell everyone is the world's first accelerator for social scientists, the ARC Accelerator. That might be true, but I'm telling everyone that it is. So take it as gospel. So that has also given me a lot of chance to see innovation from some of the other UK universities involved in Aspect.
That's great. Thanks, Chris. So I know, Chris, when we were kind of thinking about this webinar and how what we might want to talk to today, one of the first things we realized is sort of an important question and point is to lay out as the groundwork sort of what you're seeing as the differences between social sciences and maybe other disciplines and innovation in that space. So why should we even be bothering talking about social science innovation? What's different compared to STEM or other disciplines?
I mean, that's quite a hard question. I think the truth is that we don't know anything like as much about social science innovation and commercialization as we do about STEM, because that's been going on. Obviously, the activity in STEM has picked up a lot in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, but realistically, it has been going on at least 20 years, even 30 years in some universities. So there's a much more understood world, both in terms of how you commercialize, the companies that might be involved, where you get capital from, and what the life cycle of those companies are. Social sciences is, to a large extent, much newer. And I think probably the big difference from a university point of view is that the intellectual property is much softer. You're not really going to be stuff out of the lab. You might get code at best, but not really much. So that makes everything quite different from the university point of view. And I think we're seeing it's a lot more diverse in terms of the business models and the sectors that they go into. But we're only just at the kind of start of seeing that.
I mean, that's actually an interesting point. So thinking about the business models that we're seeing come from social sciences, I've heard, through stories and through speaking with people that actually the shape of these innovations does look a little bit different than STEM. And I wondered if you could share with us some of your experience of that. You know, what sort of business models are you seeing emerging? How are social science innovations making money? There, I
Yeah.
see.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I think the short answer is we don't fully understand yet. We've seen some early examples though,
Okay.
which give us a clue into that. So I think the first one is that probably about maybe 50% of them are going to be social ventures in their business model. That per se is not a business model, but it's a direction of travel. And when I say a social venture, I mean any kind of company whose primary purpose is mission driven, so it fits an environmental or social goal rather than profit. And that's been the case for an awful lot of the social science ones. So the actual profit part is definitely a lower priority in general for the social science ones. They might still make a lot of money, and some do, especially if they're coming out of areas like finance or economics. But in general, they are more focused on impact than profit. I think the second part to that is, yeah, what does some of the specific business models look like? Well, if they're a social venture, we are seeing some of them are able to pick up contracts off governments, particularly in sectors like international developments. They operate a bit like international development consultancies. That's a reasonable path. Probably the consultancy model is also like a more general one that is quite appropriate for them. So that also covers ones that are focusing on government or business, and they might start as consultancies, in fact, by an academic who over time sees that actually they're getting some of the same questions or requests over and over, and they can start productizing the consultancy work that they're doing. So it moves from basically consultancy where it's more like I'm a company X and I've got a problem, can I borrow a brain to look at it? And more towards I'm an academic who's looked at so many of these problems that I now have a process, some IP to look at it, and that's systemizing it.
I guess that's
sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say that it sort of brings a second point, which is you have the business model and then you have the product or service. And something that I've heard is that with social sciences and humanities and arts even, the product and service part also looks a little bit different. It might not just be a widget, but maybe it's, a way of delivering training or a way of measuring something or improving processes. And I wondered if you could also maybe just comment on that and the kinds of, whatever the social science widget is, what are the examples you're seeing there?
Yeah, I think that's a really large part of it actually, is using things like frameworks or processes to provide new insights into things. And I think probably best to talk in some examples in case it kind of gets too esoteric. So, we had one example. So LSE have got something called Trade Policy Hub, which is currently part of their consulting arm. But in this case, it has been advising government and businesses on how to do, adapt to trade policy changes, obviously very timely with Brexit. And originally that did start as pure consultancy, and now they're starting to productize it by providing things like toolkits and frameworks for companies who want to make themselves better able to adjust to trade policies, be that in their supply chains or their businesses, products, etc. So that's one example of how you can kind of productize, going from kind of consulting or theory into kind of productizing. Another one that I think is very good is Sophia, which is an Oxford social venture spin out from the Department of International Development. They actually grew out of kind of econometrics, where they were trying to measure poverty when you didn't just have dollar income as the main metric, which you traditionally use. They said, well, it's in a way not that meaningful just to know how much money people have, because what you really want to know is what are they missing in their lives, be that access to sanitation facilities, access to food, access to education. So they started saying, okay, how can we measure that at a systematic level, a data level, rather than obviously just kind of qualitative. So they were doing that as an academic work. And basically what happened is they got a request to do an audit of a company and see what kinds of poverty the employees in that company had. And after that, they realized there was a demand by businesses, not all businesses, but particularly multinationals, etc., who were sort of saying, actually, we want to be good employers. We think our employees will be better if they don't have poverty in their households. And so they became almost like an audit service that helped those companies improve the situation of their employees. Now, the second bit that comes out of that, which I think will also be relevant for social science, by doing all these audits and this research work, they're collating an enormous amount of data on basically economic data in all these different countries, particularly focused in Central America. And now potentially there's a route to basically sell that data to companies who want to step in and provide the services that are now identified. So, you have examples, I think, historically. I'm not saying these guys are involved, but, Procter & Gamble and Unilever have historically been involved in some rural parts of China, for example, selling particular types of products with instructions to improve hand sanitation. Well, you could imagine that Sophia could do something like that, where they work with private sector actors to say, we know that there's this type of poverty, and potentially you could step in and fill the gap. So I think those are like good examples, very practical examples of how you can build a business model. But I think you can see from Sophia, it can also be quite complex. You're not be flogging something to a consumer.
I mean, talking about that point of it being complex, we're coming at this from the angle, in many cases, of helping academics, researchers, innovators within universities to build that business or that product or that service. And, we know from doing that in STEM that the way we do that sits within an innovation ecosystem, and that there are certain parts of that ecosystem that enable that process to happen, whether it's, funding or regulation or incentives or, incubators or whatever it is. And, something you and I were thinking about the other day was, well, how does that change, or what does that look like for social sciences? Is there a different innovation ecosystem that's needed for that support and that process to happen? And I'm wondering if you might be able to comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the single biggest blocker, I think, is just the huge uncertainty around what a social science spin out is and which sectors it will go into. And that's probably the first thing that we need to try and resolve as quickly as possible. I mean, in science, in STEM, it can be quite straightforward. Even if you're not super familiar, the physicist or the engineer might say, look, I've developed a new engine type. We're like, okay, well, this is going to be something of interest to the automotive sector. It might not be so straightforward for the social sciences. I think probably the first thing to do is to basically marry getting rid of that uncertainty with getting some TTO capacity, some technology transfer officers who do get some familiarity with social sciences. I do think slightly that you will need people who are not exclusively from a STEM background, which is the traditional TTO kind of profile. I think that's partly because I think a lot of social scientists usually feel that when it comes to commercialization, they're kind of lower down the priority order compared with STEM. But I think it's also that for the more unusual business models, I think it might be a little bit harder if you aren't as familiar with social science to see where the potential might be. So I do think there needs to at least be some experience in-house. I think the other part, though, will also be basically, once you start working out which sectors are important, is trying to find basically what I'd kind of loosely call sort of innovation pathways in those sectors. And I guess a good example might be if you think about something like medical sciences, there are actually really good pathways now. If someone in a university comes up with an innovation that might go into, for example, the NHS, there are clear pathways where there are people all along the pipeline, be that venture capitalists, some of the gatekeepers like MedCity, all who can provide really important advice very early on in the product development, so that you actually create something that might be of use to the NHS and might eventually be able to get invested in and go into the healthcare system. And a lot of other kind of industries also have kind of not dissimilar sectors. We need to work those pathways out for the social sciences. And probably we're talking about central government, local government, health and social care, international development, in the environment and finance is probably like the top areas where we'll probably see the most innovations matching those sectors. But we need to work out who to speak to really early on, how to get good mentors, everything to kind of help those businesses grow.
So you mentioned a couple of things there about, in your engagement as a tech transfer officer with your ecosystem, but you also mentioned the staff, who to hire, and kind of the skills they might need. I'm wondering if, in your experience, you're finding that other parts of the tech transfer service or offering have had to change to support social sciences. So whether that means changing your template agreements or changing your success measures for what your TTO needs to achieve. I'm curious if there's been other changes you've observed in the way that you work.
I think there are a lot. I think one is probably the intellectual property was almost the first thing that you hit the buffer on. When I joined Oxford University Innovation, I got a lot of training on basically patent. I can say that I have not touched a single patent in 2.5 years, which I'm pleased about. But it is a big part of what Oxford University Innovation does normally. So that doesn't count. But what that means is that you're having academics come in who are kind of under the expectation from their science colleagues that they can protect their intellectual property when they go and create a social science spin-out. And most of the time they can't, at least not protect it through the traditional patent process. So something that Mark Mann, who is my colleague at OUI, has always been very keen on, and I completely support him in this, is that we say they have to put much more focus on building the brand and getting to market faster, because they will not be able to sit behind a patent to protect them. Now, to be fair, I would give that advice to a STEM colleague anyway. I always think there's an advantage to going to market fast. But I think it is more important for the social science spin-outs. And that basically requires a slightly different skill set. I don't think technology transfer officers traditionally thought or required how to work around branding and how to build that. And that wasn't something I necessarily had much experience with either, but it's something that I have kind of been learning along the way.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned earlier that there are examples of social science businesses making money and having impact. And we've talked a little bit just now about sort of the metrics and success metrics, and maybe patents isn't one you should be ticking off. Do we need to be adjusting our expectations of kind of what a successful social science venture looks like? Do we need a different set of criteria to weigh them against, or is it really the same?
I definitely do think we'll need different criteria. The problem is it's not going to be easy. I mean, if you think about traditional metrics that I think a university would want to talk about when it came to its technology transfer office, you'd say number of companies created, amount of investment raised. These are like the two classics, and then maybe patents afterwards. And you will probably get, apart from the first one, because social sciences can produce companies quite quickly, the second two, most of the time, even if they could raise capital, they wouldn't raise anywhere near as much as the science ones because they didn't need to. There's no big capital expenditures on laboratories or anything else like that for the main. But then that brings you on to, okay, well, how are you going to measure them outside of number? And you get into the kind of very murky terrain of impact measurements. And this is something that we absolutely have not solved at Oxford University Innovation, and to my knowledge hasn't been solved anywhere in the social venture sector. But you are essentially trying to reduce the many ways that they could help people or solve a social or environmental problem, and somehow get that into a reportable statistic where you can then demonstrate how that something that started as research has tangibly improved somebody's life. And we don't really have an answer to that beyond reporting per company. What we are asking for there is that each company picks a metric that it wants to be measured by, and it can change it, so that at least we do collect some of that data in aggregate, and then we can report that back to different people.
Interesting, yeah.
There is an advantage here, though, which is in the impact investment world, which is growing. They are also trying to kind of get on top of this problem, because the people that put money into those impact investment funds are looking for impact as well as a return. And so that's something that they will still have to solve anyway.
I mean, does it always have to be about impact or revenue, though? Conversation I was having with someone yesterday was maybe we should just acknowledge and celebrate sustainable businesses in the sense of they are sustaining themselves. Is that something we should be considering, or is that outside the remit of the university?
I definitely think it's something we should be celebrating, and we have produced quite a lot of sort of one-person companies, which we're really happy about. That said, I think if we didn't shoot for scale, we would be doing social sciences a disservice. I think there are areas where they can achieve massive scale in impact, but also actually in financial returns, and I think we shouldn't be ignoring them. And if we do get them, I think they will have a kind of sort of downstream benefit to the rest of the social science ventures by raising their profile with government, business, and investors.
That's a good point. So Chris, one of the things that I've come across in working with social science ventures through Aspect and through other initiatives is there's definitely a couple myths out there about commercialization in the social sciences. So I wondered if you would share with us some of the misconceptions that you've come across in your experience so far.
Yeah, I think there are some. I think probably the most pervasive one, which I do have to push back on, is that it's STEM light. And I think this really does a disservice to social sciences. And I think STEM light can be meant in lots of different ways. One is it can mean that, you know, the outcome's a bit fluffy. One is it can mean that they just don't raise as much money. And the third one is, yeah, just that they haven't got any physical things or, you know, molecules or something which they're selling, and therefore it doesn't quite count as much. And it's kind of a nice bit on the side, but really we're all about STEM. And I think that is absolutely not true. And I think, you know, it might be a less traceable kind of pathway of causation, but there have been some massive already influential social science, effectively spin-outs, companies formed directly from researchers who are having a huge impact. So, you know, I give two examples actually. So one is Rubini Economics. So this is the economist Nouriel Rubini. He's a big professor in the US of economics. Now he's a bigwig in the financial world because of his investment firm. And he basically founded the entire firm based on what he perceived to be a gap in the market, where he translated his insights as a professor that he'd done through his research into basically an investment thesis. Well, that shifts billions in capital every year, and it's directly out of research. So this is not really fluffy at all. This is enormous amounts of capital allocation. You can go even more esoteric if you say the effective altruist movement, which actually isn't social science. It grew out of the philosophy department at the University of Oxford. So if anyone knows about William McCaskill and all the group around that, well, actually, they have completely transformed how donations work in the charitable sector. And we're not just talking small amounts, talking hundreds of millions, because Dustin Moskovitz, one of the Facebook founders, his entire foundation invests effectively on effective altruist principles, which is basically trying to find the sort of biggest bang for your buck and particular interventions which have super high impact. So these are examples where they're not fluffy at all and they're extremely high impact. So I think they have been out there. We just don't necessarily badge them with social science, but they absolutely are.
So what about the role of social sciences in user-centered design? That's something we hear a lot about in terms of the path.
Yeah, I mean, I think...
I'm planting that one.
I know. I think, you know, user-centered design is obviously part of social science. I don't think it is representative of social science, because using something like user-centered design to improve a product through a process is highly instrumental. And I would say that most social scientists, well, a large number of social scientists focus on big macro issues. You know, if you're a political scientist, you might focus on political systems. If you're a macroeconomist, obviously you look at the economy in its entirety. So going down that micro, I don't even think it's particularly typical for social scientists. But the second part is, I think this is borne out by how many social science spin-outs become social ventures. There is a clear goal or mission behind a lot of the social science research. Even if they come from different sides of the political spectrum, I think you find very few social scientists don't believe that their research is inherently going to improve something for society or the economy. And it's not something simply to be slotted into another process as a purely kind of atomized instrumental process. So I would say that that's a tiny, tiny part of the social science commercialization process, and not remotely indicative of what I've seen.
All right. So Chris, we're starting to get some questions coming in. I'm going to ask people to keep adding in your questions. And while they do that, I have one more for you. And then we'll kind of go to the Q&A. I guess one thing that would be interesting to think about is where next? What's the future? And kind of how do we see social sciences contributing to some of the bigger trends that are going on now, whether that's COVID or climate change or other things that are out there, where there are going to be some opportunities for social sciences to get involved.
Yeah, so I think we probably want to get to a stage where it's okay for universities and people directly in the ecosystem to talk about social sciences, but I suspect in practice we will have to become more granular and talk about them for the kind of either the business model or the sector that they're going into, in order for them to appeal and kind of get traction further on. So it is a financial based spin out, or it is a environmental, climate change, whatever. I think social science itself can potentially be too broad for someone like an investor to get their head around in a meaningful way to know what to do with the information. So that would be kind of that level of maturity in the ecosystem where we've got enough that we can start just clustering. I think will really help the conversation. I think on the kind of, like big global issues like UN SDGs or COVID, where is the role of social science in that, in the commercialization space? I mean, I think with COVID, social science has probably had a disproportionate impact at the academic level, in the sense that probably up to this point, pandemics primarily treated as a kind of epidemiological public health phenomenon and kind of just kept within that. So the expertise was more exclusively in that. Whereas COVID was so large that it was impossible to detach it from things like our economic systems. And so economists were coming in and saying, well, actually, you're making all these other kind of trade-offs doing this, so you need to think about it. So that's obviously a long way off kind of commercialization process, but the fact that those two are interlinking probably will lead to commercialization opportunities further down the line. I mean, for example, things like loneliness now, I know that there's some moves in Oxford for kind of research collaboration between social science and medical science, because it's kind of accepted that something like loneliness exists in a highly social context. So you need to put both together to design an effective intervention. But there have been a couple of specific examples where actual social science spin-outs actually have been quite involved in the COVID one. And the most important one has probably been prediction markets. So Philip Tetlock, who wrote the book Super Forecasters, so he's a political scientist who spent his whole life looking at how good people are at making forecasts, has created basically a crowdsourced platform where basically people can make forecasts, a bit like betting, but it's actually a slightly different process. And that has actually outperformed a lot of epidemiologists in predicting the pandemic spread. And so it's become an important source of information for government and people making models to actually predict the spread, and therefore when they need to go into lockdown. So actually that is a good example of where social science insight has actually had a material impact on public health.
So one of the things you were talking about there, Chris, the collaborations between medical and social sciences, that actually sort of feeds one of the questions that we had come in from Alex J. So he was asking us if we could comment on how we facilitate inter or transdisciplinary impact of research, so that it also includes social sciences. And he was mentioning that we're maybe describing the outputs of these projects as one-to-one, so taking outputs from social sciences through to event or product, but that actually maybe there's other opportunities to do it more interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary. I'm wondering, have you seen those intersections between STEM and social sciences, and how do we better make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, this is very much, I think, at the frontier of where we are. There's an obvious incentive for social scientists to do more of this, because there's frankly more funding available in the STEM world. So if they can get that, then it's to their interest.
So you're telling me we need money?
There's always that requirement. I think the key with kind of the interdisciplinary angle is it's one of those words that sounds really great when you say it, but in practice is a lot harder to make work, and often you can just shove things together and they don't really fit. So my sense would be to work where there's kind of an open door. And so I gave the example of loneliness because actually that's quite a good example of an issue that medical science is taking more note of because it fits into growing mental health awareness, but actually is so clearly social science in its other respects that you can really see how that they fit together. You can, of course, do other events, like maybe get challenge-led events, like carbon reduction is another example where you might think this is a good area where social science and scientists could work together. But I would be quite careful about picking the areas and not trying to force things together. And I think it's always better to let, where possible, the academics take the lead, and then you just help support them once they think there's something there, rather than trying to do it the other way, because I don't think that works very well.
Yeah, we've got another question, Chris, that's come in from Manny Singh. Manny was asking about your comment earlier, and I think if I'm reading this question right, and Manny, you can correct me if I'm wrong in the chat box, but I think what he's asking about is why would you pick that one metric for impact when he feels that perhaps there are already an aggregate of statistics we should be using to measure impact from ventures. I think that's in response to your suggestion that each venture should pick one metric. Now, Manny, if I've misread your question, please do correct me in the chat box and clarify.
Well, I'll answer what I think was the question based on Britta's interpretation. I mean, in a sense, this is actually a much more practical problem. Startups don't have much time to do measurement, and it's actually really hard to get them to do measurement, and not unreasonably, because they're trying to just get the business going. So we just asked them to pick one because it's something they should already be measuring, because it might be just directly like how many people have they taught. And then that's relatively easy for them to report on. So it's basically a trade-off between us wanting some data, but not wanting to burden the staff. Of course, they might have loads, but even if they did have loads, they probably wouldn't be able to measure it until they were more mature, or they got someone else to do it for them, just because measurement is basically research, and that's labor intensive.
Yeah. So I will welcome more questions from the audience. If you do have questions, please ask us in the chat box. I've got 2 that we've just covered and a couple more coming in. It looks like a little comment from Manny there. Aggregates are detrimental to social science innovation, and nuance is more valuable and cheaper at the early stages. Chris also has another question. Oh, and that's a personal email to you, so I will share that with you afterwards. Chris, it's a question from Alex. In the meantime, in case other people want to ask more questions, feel free to keep adding them in the chat box. Chris, while those are coming in, I wanted to ask you, maybe for some top tips. Now I'm thinking we have to figure out who these top tips are for. Maybe let's start with a top tip for social scientists, for the academics who are thinking about doing this, and then we can switch to maybe a tip for the university teams that are supporting them and are maybe kind of getting off the ground.
Okay, well, my top tip for academic is be open to the idea, but it will not be research. So if you go down this path, it might start as research, but fundamentally what you're creating isn't research. It's a business that might use the research, but they are fundamentally different things, and you'll be spending more time than you perhaps would think on things like the business model, and trying to get people to buy your product or fund it in some way. And so it's quite a big mindset shift. I think the reason you should be excited by that is it can massively increase the impact of your research in a completely different way. And that there's a lot of different pathways open to you. So I would say you're not selling out your research. You don't have to create something that's all about profit. You can go out there and just recycle all the profit into delivering a really social, environmental outcome, whatever it is that you want. In essence, a business only has to be financially sustainable. It doesn't have to be anything else. It's just a bunch of people doing something. So definitely be open-minded about it and speak to your technology transfer office.
Great. And a tip for the tech transfer officers or other support teams that might be on this call?
I would say for the tech transfer officers,
something you wish you'd known, maybe.
What do I wish I knew? I think one of the best things, I'll give some really practical advice. I think one of the best things we started implementing at Oxford University Innovation was the business model canvas, actually, and doing that really early on. What I like about the business model canvas is it's not forcing anyone to commit to anything, because it's kind of a brainstorm, but it's kind of a structured brainstorm around what the business will need rather than the research. And by getting the academics to go through that process where you just kind of guide and you're not kind of imposing on them, I think it's really amazing for kind of enacting a mindset shift. And everyone I've worked on it with has come out with like 5 new ideas for what they can do, and has been more excited after doing it.
That's great. Now we have a request from Alex. Any tips for funders who are working in this space?
For funders, yeah, get involved, guys.
Open door, right?
Yeah, it's definitely an open door. I mean, I think one thing I will always say is there are definitely really good for-profit ones out there, and they should definitely look at the social science ones. For that said, I think you will definitely get fewer kind of 10x, 100x kind of social science ventures than you would in the STEM world. So it's probably on average of less interest to venture capitalists. I don't think that's true of impact, seed, or angels. And what I would say to those who are more in the impact investment space is you get a lot of ventures where you get really great entrepreneurs who want to do a social thing, but might not necessarily be deeply familiar with the kind of problem that they're trying to solve, but they might be great entrepreneurs. I think with academics who are trying to solve social problems, they might not at the start be as good entrepreneurs because they're less experienced, but they bring really deep insight into the problem they're solving. And so if you can build a business around it, you can be very confident that this is a really good chance of solving or helping to solve a particular problem, simply because it is steeped in actual peer-reviewed research. And I think that's quite an attractive offer for a lot of impact investors and foundations who are committed to solving problems, and why they should get behind social science entrepreneurs.
Do you feel, Chris, there's a role for public funders as well still at this stage? Is there enough in terms of the early stage investment offerings or whatever they may be, KTPs, whatever it is, are those relevant for social sciences?
I think they absolutely are. I think it is true to say that Innovate UK has done some social science stuff, but it's very towards the STEM world. And I don't think that's unreasonable. I think we need to prove to Innovate UK that there is a space for doing some more work with the social sciences and putting funding up, for sure. I also think that something like, for example, big society capital, so those like quasi-government funders, I think they can really look to social science as well as particularly effective ways to help resolve some of the social problems in the UK. So
we do have a question that sort of ties to that from Jason. He's asking if we know specific funders or can share the details of those that, well, not details, but that provide seed or Series A capital for social science startups.
Well, I mean, I couldn't comment on that until I knew more about the startup. Obviously, if there's one, I think it's fairly straightforward. You're going to go to the ones that do just tech, which is why I think, in a way, at least when you get to the investment stage, thinking about it in terms of social science isn't the right way to think about it. If you've got a finance startup because it came out of your financial research, then you're a fintech, or you might be, or you're a consultancy. And if you're doing something in kind of extremely international development, then you'll probably want to go for like Gates Foundation. And if it's maybe international development with a public health angle, then you could think about Wellcome. So I think, that's the way you need to think about the investment landscape.
Yeah. I suppose it's the same as any other sort of startup. You choose the right kind of investor for your opportunity in that regard.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, I guess we're getting to the end of our time now. I suppose if there's any other questions that come through, we'll try and squeeze them in here, or if not, we can follow up offline. Chris, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you. I know we get to work together occasionally, but we don't get to sit down and chat like this as much. So this has been great. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much again for inviting me, and thank you everyone for your questions. I think my email will be made available, so please feel free to just drop me an email. There aren't many Chris Fellinghams anyway, so if you just Google me with the word on, I should come up.
That's great.
And I'll be happy to chat.
That's great. Thank you, Chris. And for those of you who would like to attend our next webinar, we will be sending a link and information to that in the email that goes out to all of you after this. So keep an eye out for that in your inboxes. And with that, I think we shall close out today. So thank you everyone for coming and spending your time with us. Bye-bye.